Thank you, everybody, and thank you for all of you showing up tonight. This is a beautiful place and a very nice little town, too. I got to spend a little bit of time here today, and very, very nice. Our organization, StrongTowns, is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to support a model of growth that allows America's towns to become financially strong and resilient. We talk about cities, we talk about towns, counties, parishes, boroughs. We're really talking about our local units of government, the kind of places that you all are from. We could have named our organization Strong Local Units of Government. It would have been a really long web address. Wouldn't have fit well on a business card. So we're called Strong Towns. If we go back and forth, just interpolate in your head, we're talking about local units of government. There's three primary takeaways from this presentation. I'll begin with this and I'll end with this. The first is that the future for most cities is not going to resemble the recent past. The second, I skipped to the second. The current path cities are on is not financially stable. Second, the future for most cities is not going to resemble the recent past. And then third, the main determinant of future prosperity for cities will be the ability of local leaders to transform their communities. I want to step way, way back with you to begin. These are two artist renderings of ancient civilizations. The one on the left is a city called It's in the Fertile Crescent. It's the oldest known civilization that we've excavated. The one on the right is, of course, ancient Rome. When you look at these two cities, you're looking at places that had been around at this point, at the point they became this, for thousands of years. These are places that were built around the predominant transportation mode of the day, that being, of course, your 2 feet. These places were built around people that walked, by people that walked. The way the buildings were scaled, spaced, located, was all based around a culture that walked. Over thousands and thousands of years, we refined this approach in a trial and error kind of way. When things didn't work, we abandoned that. When things did work, we copied it and built on it. And by the time you got to, this is my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota, in early 1900s, by the time we got to here, we had essentially a universal type approach. Civilizations around the world, different continents, different latitudes, different cultures, all built in a very similar way. It was a very resilient way. It was a very financially productive way. It was a very culturally and politically resilient type of approach, one that was formed by trial and error. Before the Great Depression, but then stalling out and then picking up again after World War II, we began to build places around the new transportation technology of the day, that being the automobile. We came up with different building styles, different building types, different ways of doing things. If you're ever asked to explain this, as Americans, we like to talk about this in terms of progress. We used to be a civilization that walked everywhere, and so we built our cities around people who walked. Now we are a civilization that drives, so we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities around people with jet cars. And someday we will teleport, and we will have completely different cities than what we have today. This is a very affirming way to look at the changes that we've undergone in our cities. It's a narrative of progress. There's another way to look at this that isn't quite as affirming. And I want to plant this seed in your head because as we go along tonight, it's going to be very important. When you look at these artist renderings, and you look at the ruins of these places, and even if you visit one of these today and kind of walk around and look at it, even back then, you're looking at places that had endured long enough to actually become important, to actually become ruins today, right? You're looking at a method of building that was developed in the hardest, kind of most natural way you can. This was evolution of cities. This was trial and error over many thousands of years. And by the time you get to my city, literally we stand on the backs of what people had done millennia earlier, their failures, the hard knocks that they had to develop a method and an approach to building that was incredibly resilient. When you look at this approach here today, this seems very familiar to us. This is what we know. This is what we understand. This seems like the way things have always been done. But it's important to understand that this has been around a very short period of time. And the knowledge on how to do this is not the result of thousands of years or even decades of trial and error experimentation. The knowledge for how to do this is literally all theoretical. the idea of use-based zoning, separation of uses, the hierarchical road network, the way we finance growth and development. All of these things are new tools that we have developed very, very recently to help us do things, to help us build in this way. It's important to understand that we are living through the greatest experiment socially, culturally, politically, and financially that humanity has ever done. And we didn't try it out in, Kentucky to see if it would work before we brought it to Ohio. We just did it across this whole continent, everywhere, all at once. What we're going to talk about today are some of the financial ramifications of that maybe weren't evident to us when we began this 60, 70 years ago, but now are kind of staring us in the face. If you look at the way we finance growth way back when, you go back 100 years to this city, to cities in Ohio, if we were going to have growth and development here, it was going to be a byproduct of things we did locally. If we were going to have jobs, if we were going to have economic development, if we were going to have growth and opportunity, those things were going to be byproducts of initiatives that we took locally, privately, publicly, what have you. If you fast forward to today, you see that growth and job creation and development has become a shared responsibility between local units of government and state and federal governments. And because of that, we have developed three primary mechanisms that we use to fund growth at the local level. The first one is transfer payments between governments. This is the idea that the federal government, the state government would make investments in local governments, maybe help build a water system, expand a sewage treatment facility, build a road or a public facility. The second mechanism of growth, transportation spending. This is the notion that we can create growth, development, jobs by making investments in transportation. We add highway lanes, we put in interchanges, we build transit lines, we build frontage roads. All these create a platform and an inducement for more growth. The third mechanism is debt. We certainly can talk about public sector debt. Public sector debt is an important part of this conversation. If you went back to 1950, the average city spent 2% of their budget on debt service. Today that is 15% and growing. I've seen cities that spend 55% of their budget on debt service. But more important than public sector debt is private sector debt. The ability to get long-term financing, the ability to have that financing sold onto a secondary market, packaged up, securitized, bought up by Chinese pension funds and what have you, has created a ton of liquidity in our system. These three mechanisms of growth we use to, of course, create growth, and that provides us with the tax revenue that we need to do things. There's some really powerful reasons why we at the local government level look at these transactions in a purely positive way. The initial cost for us of that new growth is usually very nominal. When the federal government comes in with a grant, when the DOT comes in with a project, when the private sector comes in and makes an investment, we may have a local match, we may have a little bit of staff time, but generally as local taxpayers, we're paying a very small portion of that overall transaction. Our portion of that is very nominal. However, the benefit that we get is substantial. All of a sudden now we have all this new growth, we have all this new tax base, and our coffers feel very, very flush. The catch is that we agree as local taxpayers to maintain and provide service to those areas forever. We agree that we will fix the pipe, we will repair the sidewalk, we will fix that road, we will fix the water tower, the treatment facilities, and everything else that goes along with it. We are, and that's not me, that's the microphone, sorry. We are, in a sense, exchanging a near-term cash bonus for a long-term liability. If you think this through over multiple life cycles, in other words, if you take a long-term view of this development pattern, there's only one of two ways that this makes financial sense. Either growth is going to continue at ever-accelerating rates. In other words, we're always going to be able to produce that much more new growth that we then have all this excess cash from that we can redeploy to other things. Or the pattern of development, the way we actually build our places, is going to create more for us in terms of wealth and prosperity than it generates long-term in cost. I think we intuitively understand that the first one is not true. Unfortunately, the second assumption is also not true. And this is where, for just a brief little bit, this presentation will get a tiny bit technical. I'm an engineer. I think I'm required by my license to get a little bit technical with you. I have an aversion to models. We were talking a little bit at dinner tonight about modeling. I'm allergic to theoretical models, largely because I've worked with enough of them, and I know that if the model is trying to capture all the complexity that goes on in a city, it will have 1,000 different variables, and as soon as you start tweaking them, you can get radically different results. If you make your model too simple, what you find is that that simple model doesn't capture all the complexity that resides in our cities and our local governments. What we have done, instead of trying to theoretically project out, we've actually looked back at developments that have happened and said, what can we learn from them? And we specifically target the kind of cleanest, simplest developments, that we can look at the very kind of essential parts of our development pattern and understand what's going on. This is probably the most simple one you're going to find. This is a dead-end cul-de-sac. These are residential lots, 2.5 acres. The only infrastructure here is a paved road. This was built in the mid-1990s. When it was paved, the city paid half, the property owners paid half. There's no commercial traffic, there's no through traffic. It's just the people that live here that utilize this road. We asked the question, okay, based on the taxes that the city is collecting from the people that live within this area, how long is it going to take them to recoup what they just spent to build that road? The answer is 37 years. Now, the road's not going to last anywhere near 37 years, but it's going to take the city that long to just recoup the half of what they spent to build it. It's entirely the city's responsibility to fix and maintain it after it falls apart. This is a little bit more intense development. These are 3/4 acre, half-acre lots. The ones here on the west are a little bigger, but you can see they have a minimal amount of frontage. Again, you've got a closed-loop system with a dead-end cul-de-sac. These are all residential properties. There's no through traffic. There's no commercial traffic. Unless somebody gets lost, the only people using this road are the people that live there. This was built in the early 1980s. It completely fallen apart. The city went out to fix it. The cost for that fix was $354,000. We asked the question, based on the taxes that the city's collecting from the people within that development, how long is it going to take them to recoup that money they just spent to fix the road? The answer is 79 years. We then asked the question, okay, let's pretend the city wanted to try to collect enough money between now and the time the road fell apart to actually have the cash to fix the road. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the road. Now, sometimes people will say, okay, Chuck, we get it, we understand, we know we lose money on commercial property, we make it up, or on residential, we make it up on commercial, right? Commercial's the cash cow. And my response always to that is, okay, I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of its holdings and tries to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why an incorporated municipality would want to operate that way. Nonetheless, we have this cultural belief that if we can just get enough business going, we can kind of sock it to them and make up for the fact that our residential neighborhoods don't pay for themselves. This is a commercial business park. This is the kind of thing we build on the edge of our cities to try to create opportunity and growth and attract new business investment. This one was built in the mid-1990s. Think of the wide industrial-sized streets, sewer, water, storm sewer, the whole deal. This is completely built out today. And the city felt it was such a successful project that they want to repeat it. They want to do the same exact thing on property they own, just right next door. They're just going to mirror exactly what they have. So we asked the question, if we could do the exact same project at the exact same price and get the exact same return, would that be a good investment for the city? In today's dollars, it would cost $2.1 million to build this. We can look and see there's $6.6 million of investment that's happened in this park. Now, pause here for a second and understand. Of that $6.6 million of investment, 4 of those lots are owned by a church. Now, I go to church. Churches are a very important part of the community, but the church is not paying any taxes to the city. 2 of the lots are a school bus maintenance facility. Again, I went to public schools. My kids go to public schools. Schools are a very important part of the community, but the school district is not paying any taxes to the city. One of the lots is a county maintenance garage. One of the lots is a city maintenance garage. Of the remaining lots, the ones that are theoretically private sector taxpayers, every single one was either sold for $1 and or the business was given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to move into this park. For the sake of our analysis, we assumed that the entire new park would be built out within a year, that every single lot would be a private sector taxpayer, and none of them would get a subsidy. If that were the case, and if every penny of new revenue went to retiring that debt, it would still take almost 3 decades, 29 years, for the city to break even. That's 3 decades where everybody else's taxes in town would need to go up to provide police protection, fire protection, plow the streets, mow the ditches, and provide every service that would be needed out there. Because in the most wildly optimistic scenario, it takes them that long just to break even. Now, I used to do, and Della, you may have seen when I did this, I used to have some of these, I would do like a dozen examples, and people would be like crying at the end, and they'd be like, please, we get it, stop, this merciless beating. I found that I can do it in 3. If you're someone who wants more of these examples, I've got, at the end I'll give you our website. There's a bunch of them on our website you can go. But I found that with 3 I can make the point, and I'm just going to cut to the chase. And again, I apologize for being an engineer. I like graphs. I'll walk you through this one too. Let's pretend that a developer comes to our city. Developer says, I have a piece of property out here I would like to build on. I am willing to follow all of your rules. I'm not asking for any subsidies. I'm not asking for any variances. I will go in, I will build all the infrastructure. I'll build all the streets and the pipes and the sidewalks. I'll put in the valves and the pumps and the manholes. I will build all the residential properties. I'll build all the commercial properties. The only thing I'm asking from you, local government, is that when I'm done building all this, I be allowed to donate the infrastructure to you to maintain. What would we say? We say, fantastic. Are you joking me? You're going to spend all the money building all this stuff. You're asking nothing from us. You're going to follow all of our rules. And at the end of the day, we get all this growth and it costs us nothing, right? Let's say in the back of our minds we had heard about this whole Strong Towns thing, and we want to be prudent people. We weren't planning on this money coming in. So what we're going to do is when the money comes in from this new development, we're going to take the portion that would normally go to pay for maintenance, and we're going to set that aside. And every year when the money comes in, we're going to set it aside and we're going to allow it to grow, and we're going to dedicate that money to the maintenance of this new liability that we're taking on. This is what that looks like. In year 1, everything is brand new. You haven't spent anything. The money comes in from these new taxpayers and you set it aside. In year 2, everything is still relatively brand new. The money comes in and you simply add to what you had in year 1. In year 3 you add, in year 4 you add, and every year you continue to add more money. You've got a 10-year-old street, it's not costing you anything. Got a 15-year-old pipe, it's relatively maintenance free. Everything looks great. And when you get a couple decades out, you've accumulated quite a bit of money. The problem is when you have to actually go out and make good on that promise you made when you took on that long-term liability, what you find is that the cumulative amount of money you brought in is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, you run far into the negative. Now, a city is not one development, right? Cities are a collection of developments, a collection of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes back in a couple years later and says, that project worked out so well for me, it worked out so well for you, I would like to do it again. Similar size project. And in fact, every year, kind of from there on forward, a developer walks in the door and says, I would like to do a similar size project. So this is the ideal scenario, right? For a city, nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that revenue coming in and we set it aside and we allow it, to grow for the day that we're going to need it to make good on that promise we made way back when we said, yep, we'll do that transaction. This is what that looks like. In year 1, you've got your first development. In year 3, you add another one. In year 5, you add another one. Year 7, you can see as you go on, you're continuing not only to accumulate money from each development, but to add additional growth, add new developments. And so your revenue actually starts to kind of accelerate upwards. You have, this kind of robust growth because you're having all these new developments come online. And when you get to year 25, the year you have to make good on that promise you made in year 1, you've got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? You've had all this growth, so you've got it. This is what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money over the long term on every project that you do, ultimately, as you get further out in the time horizon, there's this continual downward pressure on your budget. Now, we started this whole conversation by saying this is a very young experiment. We've been doing this 60, 70 years. I've had people look at this and say, well, okay, Chuck, I get what you're saying. It makes sense. But we should have gone broke a long time ago. How did we get this far? That's with this graph here. This is a graph of debt. Now, we're all familiar to one degree or another with the conversation we're having about our national debt, right? Our national debt is enormous. We just had this big, drag-out debate over whether it would be 17 trillion or 20 trillion. I had 7 quarters of calculus. I'm not going to pretend to understand what $1 trillion is. It's an unfathomable sum. In fact, I like to tell this story. When I was in 4th grade, we had the weekly reader. You guys have the weekly reader? There was a little breakout box in the weekly reader that said if you took the national debt and converted it to dollar bills and stacked them on top of each other, they would go to the moon and back 23 times or something like that. As if replacing one abstract concept with another abstract concept would make things really clear for a 4th grader, right? Our national debt is enormous, right? And this graph here, this blue line on the bottom, represents the growth in our national debt. The black one right above it is a GDP. That green one, the one that soars up like that, that's our private sector debt. That's debt that you and I share. That's home mortgages, commercial real estate loans, auto loans, credit cards, margin interest accounts, student loans. The way we paid for the first generation, the first life cycle of this new experimental way of building was by taking our savings and by reinvesting that illusion of wealth back into more growth. When that became insufficient to keep everything going, in other words, when all of a sudden we had outflows as well as inflows, and it wasn't just all this wealth that we were creating, but we actually had to start maintaining stuff, our economy started to bog down. And it took us a while to figure out what to do. But we ultimately shifted from an economy based on growth through savings and investment to an economy based on growth through debt accumulation. And as we crossed over into the third life cycle of this experiment, growth through debt accumulation became such a critical part of our economy that we actually allowed it to become predatory. We actually allowed systems to arise where we encouraged people who couldn't afford homes to buy homes. We encouraged people who could afford modest homes to buy large homes. People who could afford large homes to buy extravagantly large homes. We said, you don't need a down payment. You don't need to show that you can make a payment. You don't even need a job. We needed the growth so bad that we allowed our systems to prey on our fellow community members. Our ability to continue this experiment by taking on accelerating levels of debt in the private sector is just simply not there. Obviously, there's some huge implications to all of this. The mechanisms of growth we become accustomed to are waning. The federal and state governments are vastly overcommitted. You guys know that more than anyone, right? When you send out the call for help, say we need this to, they're just right there to answer, right? Yeah. And it's been dwindling over time because they're overcommitted. And we're never going to be as high a priority as all the other things that are in their committed category, right? The DOTs are massively overcommitted. And when we take an accounting, and I've seen states where they've taken an accounting of how much it's going to cost to actually maintain what they have and compare that to the budget that they have coming in, and you're not talking about small policy tweaks. You're talking about massive, massive changes in how the DOTs operate. The DOTs are functionally broke around this country, and they do not have the capacity to continue to make these low return investments in our local communities. The private sector is completely tapped out. And we may be able to manufacture the illusion of growth for a short while longer, but the ability of the private sector to continue to take on accelerating levels of debt is just simply not there. This means that local governments are going to be forced to absorb the costs of their development pattern. If we want that road fixed, we're going to have to pay for that. If we want that pipe repaired, we're going to have to find a way to make that happen. If we want that water tower fixed or that new building, that's going to have to come from a pooling of our resources locally. This can't be done in the current pattern of development without some enormously large tax increases or some devastatingly large cuts in services. Now, I didn't come here to tell you what you already know, right? This is the debate we're having at every level of government in this country. How big is the tax increase going to be? Who's going to pay for it? How deep is the service cut going to be? And where is it going to be felt? It is critical at the local level that we see the third variable in that sentence. The third variable being the current pattern of development. As long as we continue to build in a way that costs us more over the long term than it generates in wealth, there's no way that our cities are going to avoid going bankrupt. As long as we continue to build with a method and a style and approach that gives us an illusion of wealth today, but long term leaves us with these crippling liabilities, there's no way that our cities are going to avoid defaulting on their fundamental obligations. We literally have to start having a conversation about how we build more productive places. So what's the solution? I had to put this in because as I was giving talks to different groups and meeting with different groups of people and going through different versions of this presentation, I was getting the same question at the end every time. Someone would stand up and say, "Chuck, you've come here, you've delivered the doom and gloom message, you haven't told us how to fix anything, and I'm mad at you. What is the solution? Don't just stand here and tell us things are bad. Tell us what the solution is." It was very frustrating for me because this is a very complex thing. And we're going to spend the next 3 or 4 hours talking about the... We're not going to spend that long. We're going to spend the next little bit of time here talking about things that we can do to try to change this. But I would get to the end, and I would always have someone stand up and say, "You didn't give us a solution." It took me a while to understand what was being asked. And you guys are asked this all the time. Solve this problem. Solve it. What I was being asked was different. What I was hearing asked was this: "Chuck, what is the solution?" What was actually being asked was something very different. What was actually being asked was this: what can someone else change about what they're doing so that I don't have to change anything about what I'm doing? Okay? We have to acknowledge that we have created for ourselves as a very complex set of problems. A complex set of problems that defy a solution or a series of solutions. And what we need to get in a mode of as local officials is not talking about how do we solve this problem. There's no solution to this set of problems. The only thing there is are rational and irrational ways that we can respond to them. And we have to start talking about how, as a group of intelligent people, do we look at the resources that we have and deploy them as successfully as we can to rationally respond to this complex set of problems. I always start with this photo. When we start to talk about how do we rationally respond, I start with this photo because it's a reset kind of conversation. This is my hometown back in the early 1900s. My city right now today is 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So this literally was the middle of nowhere, right? It was multiple days' journey from anything you would call civilization. Yet, look at the place they built. As a planner, this is incredible to me. I mean, I look at the way the buildings line up, the way they frame the public realm. I look at this great segmentation of space. The buildings themselves have great symmetry. They connect with the public realm really nicely. The interface is perfect. This is gorgeous. We would kill to have a street like this today, right? This is beautiful. And financially, incredibly productive. Let me ask you some questions about this place. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and commissions did they have to go to get an approval to build something? Yeah, if that. How many engineers and planners and economic development advisors did they retain here? How much tax subsidy did they give out? How many federal grants did they receive? We could go on and on. with the litany of things that we have come to believe are essential to creating jobs and opportunity and prosperity in our communities, and these people had none of them. None. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. How did they build such a spectacular place? It's really easy. They just took what they knew worked, and they did that. They looked around at the materials they had on hand, and they said, how do we adapt these materials to do what we know works? They literally copied what had been done for thousands and thousands and thousands of years that they knew was going to work. After 60 years of this new experimental approach, professionals like myself advising cities on the best way to create jobs and prosperity for all, this street looks like this today. The exact same street. It's a wasteland of parking lots and half-occupied buildings. And if you want to see in one photo why our local governments are going broke across America, right there. There's a $500,000 public investment in the infrastructure in those 2 blocks. And what is our return on that investment? Yeah, hardly anything. Certainly not anywhere near what's needed to keep that afloat. It's funny because I was giving a talk in Boise, Idaho, and I got to this, and a student stood up and back. It was at a university. A student stood up and said, I'm from Costa Rica. We're a very poor country. We don't have a lot of money. We can't build this way. We build 1 block at a time, and before we can build the next block, we have to fill in every gap of that block. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build like that. Okay, we're now a very poor country too. And we can't afford to build like that anymore either. And our illusion of wealth made us think that it was okay to have vast stretches of our city with no financial return. We simply can't build that way. We simply don't have the money to build like this. And even in this really nice city, there's blocks and blocks. There's miles and miles of stuff like this, right? Build it and they will come. Fantastic movie plot, right? Iowa, cornfields, baseball, it's got a little bit of everything. Horrible economic development strategy. Yet it has become our default economic development strategy at the local level. How many of you have ever uttered the words, you need to spend money to make money? You got to get out there and make stuff happen. We got to make this investment and be ready for growth. Even 20 years ago, that would have been crazy. We have become so desperate for growth that we now actually expect our local governments to be the dumb money at the table. The people that go out and make up for every gap in every investment to try to create those jobs and growth. And if you're not doing that, you're looked at as anti-business, right? Let me show you how wealth is created and has always been created. Do you guys recognize this street? Does that street look familiar to any of you? That is my hometown in 1870. That is that exact same street 30 years earlier. And you can think of a bunch of, illiterate lumberjacks stumbling off the train, cutting down the trees that were there, planing them into being, popping up these little buildings. This was the smallest increment of investment. Every city in the world that was started prior to World War II was started in this way. Manhattan started like this. Rome started like this. Every city started like this, with one little tiny pop-up block worth of investment. For a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to project, defy our ability to predict, defy our ability to even understand after the fact, thousands of places that were built like this failed. They completely, utterly failed. It was the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong place. What happened when they failed? Did Wall Street need a $1 billion bailout from the federal government? Did your pension fund lose 25%? Did unemployment skyrocket? No. What happened? This was a very small investment. And because it was a very small investment, a very little bit was lost. And they literally just took the windows out, took the iron off, and moved on to the next successful city. For a variety of reasons, complex, defying our ability to predict, project, or even understand. It was the right people in the right place in the right time. A lot of these cities were successful. And when they were successful, this small little increment continued to grow. And the city would grow in small increments, grow out in small increments, grow up in small increments, and grow in intensity in small increments. And after 30 years, those little shacks became those 2- and 3-story wood structures. And as this development pattern, the traditional pattern that we've used for thousands of years, continued to mature, what you see is that the city continued to grow out in small increments, continued to grow up in small increments, and continued to intensify and mature in small increments. So these 2- and 3-story wood structures became these. You had now granite brick facade buildings. You don't create wealth by going to the casino and putting it on red. The way you build wealth is by making small incremental investments over a broad area over a long period of time. That is the way we have always built wealth. And it's what we've gotten away from in this whole post-World War II experiment with the illusion of wealth. Let me show you how productive the traditional pattern of development is. These are 2 identical blocks in my hometown. The one on the left we've called Old and Blighted. The one on the right we've called Shiny and New. They are identical in shape, size, configuration. They have but the same thoroughfare, the same neighborhood. They have the same amount of public infrastructure investment. Everything about them is the same. The only thing that is different is the style of development upon them. That Old and Blighted block looks like this. Remember that 1870s photo with the pop-up block? This was the pop-up block of the 1920s. These were built in the 1920s. This was the next increment out. There were 3 blocks in a row here that were built all around the same time. And, what happened after they were built, right? We had the Depression, we had World War II, and then we had a completely different style of development. And so the development just leaped over this, and we started building the strip malls and the drive-thrus and all that stuff out a little bit further. And these have stagnated for 90 years. Instead of growing up incrementally and intensifying, they've just sat there like this. This is the most run-down, decrepit block in my hometown. 2 blocks over looked the exact same. We labeled it as blight and scheduled it to be torn down. And now we have this. This is our Taco John's. This is our taco drive-through restaurant. Everybody was thrilled to get the taco joint. Because not only did we get rid of a blighted block, but this met all the zoning codes. It met the sign ordinance. The parking ratios were great. The engineer was thrilled because we got rid of the on-street parking, and now this thoroughfare, the cars can move a little bit faster. Even the environmentalists were happy because they convinced the city to require native plants in the stormwater area so they could call this like a green development, right? Here's what nobody bothered to ask. That Old and Blighted block has a total value of $1.1 million. That Shiny and New block, same size area, same amount of public infrastructure, same everything, brand new, $800,000. That old, junky, rundown block is worth 41% more. And understand what you're looking at. You're looking at that old, blighted block in its infant stage, right? That's the very first pop-up little iteration. That's the smallest level of investment that could have been made. And it's stagnated for 90 years. And the neighborhood around it has changed to be completely auto-oriented, totally different than the business model of anybody that would locate in there. That is at its worst. And it still outperforms, not by a little bit, by a wide margin, this brand new. And we all know the trajectory of the taco joint, right? 20 years from now, there'll be a new taco joint up the road. That one will become a used car lot. 10 years later, it will be boarded up. They'll be selling drugs out the back, and the city will be asking for a grant to tear it down and have something new built there, right? We've all been around long enough to actually see that happen. We understand how that works. Let me ask you this. Say you walk out of here tonight and you have a deep understanding that the problem that we face in America is not a lack of growth. We've had decades of the most phenomenal growth you can imagine. We don't lack growth. What we lack is not growth, but productive growth. Growth that actually yields prosperity and returns higher than the level of investment. And so The goal then becomes, how do we make these properties more productive? How do we make them more valuable? Without spending a lot of resources, without spending a lot of money, what would you do over the next decade to double the value of that old and blighted block? You could add residential. We could change the city's code so that they could actually put residential there or even build a second story, which is illegal today. Anything else? Go ahead.
Infill.
We could do infill, yeah. There's a one parking lot there in the end that could be filled up. Anything else? I'm telling you, we could go grab 25 random residents off your streets, bring them in a room and ask them to come up with ideas. And they would come up with dozens and dozens of ideas. Put in a bike rack, put in a planter, sweep the sidewalk, paint the stores, slow down the traffic out front, connect the neighborhood. I mean, there's an infinite number of ideas to make that more valuable, and you don't need a PE to figure them out, right? What would you do to double the value of that property right there over the next decade? You don't have any money, you don't have any resources, but you want to make policy shifts and changes and maybe small investments that would make that property more valuable. What would you do? I have no ideas. I have no clue. The traditional style of development has incredible upside potential and very limited downside potential. The new experimental approach has a very limited upside and has a downside that can literally go to 0 or negative. Very, very fragile. Let me show you what this looks like on the edge of the city. This is our Mills Fleet Farm complex. In Ohio, do you guys have Mills Fleet Farm in Ohio?
No, they don't.
Okay. What's that? Oh, Menards, okay. Mills Fleet Farm is different than Menards. Mills Fleet Farm, you walk into Mills Fleet Farm, you have auto parts, lumber, animal feed, guns and ammo, camouflage lingerie. That's kind of your product mix at Mills Fleet Farm. A little bit different than Menards. Yeah. So this is our Fleet Farm. We doubled the size of it. This is a huge big box store. This is a Mills auto dealership and a Mills gas station. So this is a 19-acre Mills complex, the most valuable piece of property in the entire area. When the Mills people show up at a city council meeting, we just stop the city council meeting and ask them, you know, what can we do for you? What do you need today? This is 19 acres of Brainerd's downtown. If any of you have seen the movie Fargo, it is a not so flattering but probably accurate depiction of the current state of downtown Brainerd. When I was in junior high, these two buildings burnt down. They're now a parking lot. When I was in high school, that one burned down. It's now a parking lot. When I was in college, those burned down. They're now a parking lot. In my life, the predominant investment in the downtown has been wait for something to burn down, clear out the rubble, and then pave it, right? Most of the second and third stories are unoccupied, and a lot of the first stories are unoccupied as well. Not a place that would be considered a gem by any means. That Mills Fleet Farm property, 19 acres out on the edge of town, has a total value of $0.6 million per acre. It's a very valuable property. That's a lot of money. Our old traditional rundown downtown, with all the buildings that have burnt down and been turned into parking lots, the same size, 19 acres, just a different style of development, has a total value of $1.1 million per acre. How much did it cost us to get that Mills Fleet Farm? The DOT spent over $100 million on the bypass itself. Okay? The city spent $36 million just to get the sewer out to the site. When I was an engineer, I built that road right there. That was $2 million. This is a county road, multiple millions. That was that intersection right there. The state DOT just redid last summer, $500,000 just to redo that intersection alone. Enormous levels of investment. How much has my generation spent to get that? It's 78% more valuable on a per acre basis. How much did my generation spend to create that? Yeah, nothing. That is the wealth that my great-grandparents and their contemporaries built slowly and incrementally over time. And what we have done is just slowly milked it, right? What happens when Mills Fleet Farm goes out of business? What happens when the market for camouflage lingerie dries up, right? What happens, right? We all know, because we've all seen it happen, right? We've all seen the empty big box store. It's very hard to reuse. What happens when one of those 134 properties in the downtown has a business that goes out of business, or a tenant that moves out? It's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for someone else. What we have done is we have taken a development pattern that is incredibly resilient financially, incredibly productive financially, and very resilient just culturally. And we've replaced it with one that is vastly more expensive to build, far less financially productive, and very, very fragile. I know that sales tax is an issue, so I threw this in. A friend of mine named Joe Minicozy has done these analysis around the country, and he finds the same thing every place, no matter where you go. This is one example from Asheville, North Carolina. Walmart versus the downtown building, 34 acres versus 0.2. You're getting about 100 times the property tax value per acre downtown as you're getting out here. Sales tax is about double downtown than out here. Nobody lives legally at Walmart, but you're getting 90 people per acre downtown. And at Walmart, in terms of job creation, 5.9 jobs per acre versus 73.7 in the traditional downtown. And we all understand intuitively the difference between 5.9 Walmart jobs and 73 jobs by local business owners in a downtown. Joe has this great way of showing communities where their most financially productive areas are. And he actually has a process he goes through where he plots this on a map so that the more financially productive, the more you're getting back from a certain area to the higher the line is. This is a graph we put together for High Point, North Carolina. Can you tell me where the traditional downtown is? Right? By the way, this is where their new mall, Super Target and Super Walmart are all out here. So you can see the difference in the return, the financial productivity of those places. This is an amazingly productive style of development. It's important as public officials that we start to ask a different set of questions. Right now, when we do projects, we tend to look at them like this. We are going to invest some money, we're going to create jobs, we're going to create growth, and then there's going to be investment that follows that. Right? And when it's reported, when our economic development advisors and engineers come to us, and when it gets passed on to the paper and the propaganda to kind of get support for the project, we'll say stuff like, we're going to spend $1 million and then there's going to be $4 million of private sector investment that follows. And it has a good ring to it, right? We spend 1, we get 4. Sounds fantastic. Of course, where's that 1 coming from? That 1 is tax money, right? And where's that 4 taking place? That 4 is taking place in the private sector. Now, I'm a big private sector guy. I think the private sector should do way more than it does today. But this math is just like, that doesn't work, right? If we actually want to have governments that are solvent, that could create ongoing wealth and prosperity, we have to ask how much of this actually ends up back here, right? So when we're talking about return on investment, we're not talking about this relationship. We're actually talking about this relationship. What is the amount that is then captured that allows us to repeat this trick over and over? It is easy to create growth, jobs, and prosperity if we're willing to throw money at it, right? It is much more difficult to repeat that again and again and again. That's our challenge right now. We have to start asking questions about the second life cycle. You know, we have this great analysis that we do as engineers where we'll compare different projects. And we'll take the initial costs, we'll take the annual maintenance costs, and then we'll take this thing at the end called salvage value. That's the value that you can get for what's left over when you're done using it. And we put that all into present terms, and we use that to compare one project to another. Which one's a better project, right? This works really great if you're Walmart. Walmart amortizes their stores over 12 to 15 years. And so at the end of 12 to 15 years, Walmart can look at their store and say, you know what, is this store working for us? Would we be better off a mile up the road? Would we be better off closing this store? And if they move or close the store, what do? They salvage the shelving, they salvage the fixtures, and they use that, you know, as an output of that store for the next one. But when you're a city and that pipe is run its course of its life, or that street needs to be repaired, or that overpass is met its time and needs to be fixed, do we get to say, you know what, your development just didn't work out. I'm sorry, I know you live there, but we're just going to abandon your pipe because the money doesn't work for us. And we're going to move to a different development out here. We don't get to say that, do we? That's not an option for us. And so if we're going to talk about different projects and different approaches, we have to start talking about the second life cycle. If we're going to have a salvage value, what's the replacement cost that comes right after it? It is really easy to do a project in the first life cycle, right? When I was an engineer, we were always interviewed for these jobs. Nobody was interested in how good of an engineer we were, right? Nobody asked me, how do you compute the grade of a pipe? Nobody cared. What do they care about? Can you get money? Are you good at working with grant agencies? Do you know how to pull funding together? Because today, how do we do all projects? First, we go to the federal government and we say, how much money can we get from a federal program to make this happen? Then we go to the state government. I was in Mississippi last week, so that's not your flag, obviously. Totally different place. How much can we get from the state government to make this project happen? Then we go to the private sector and we say, what can we get out of the private sector in terms of assessments or contributions to make this project happen? And then the last little piece is, what do we have to contribute as taxpayers, right? We are so good at this. We are so good at this. In fact, city administrators, city engineers are lauded, and they put on their resume, here's all the projects I was able to get done, right? We're all about doing projects. That's the easy part. That's the easy part. The second life cycle is the hard part, right? Because when you go, you've got this street that you built, you go to the federal government and say, we've got these few patches of sidewalks we need fixed. How willing are they to step up with money to do that, right? You go to the state government and say, we got this block of pipe that's settled and gone bad, we need to replace. How willing are they to step up and help you with that? The private sector is already paid, and they're paying taxes every year. They expect you to maintain this stuff on the taxes they're paying you. How often do they say, we want to pay 3 times what we're paying now for this? Never, right? So who does that leave the second life cycle? Just Mayor Quimby, right? It's just us. If we're doing projects to create growth, then the growth we create better create enough revenue for us to offset all of these contributions by the time you get to the second life cycle, or we're building throwaway projects. I want to just talk briefly about economic gardening. I'm going to spend 15 seconds on this. I know that the mantra here is jobs, jobs, jobs. And you guys, because you're this battleground state, we hear all about all your nuances of your politics all over the country. Jobs, 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 right? It is easy to create jobs. It is easy to pay and buy jobs. What's harder to do, but vastly better, is to grow jobs. We need to have a strategy, and there's a group with the Edward Lowe Foundation working on this. If you're interested in economic development, write down economic gardening, go do a Google search, you'll find it. Instead of trying to attract that one business that will provide 200 jobs, let's look at the 200 businesses we have and see what policies and strategies can we have that will create 1 job in each. And if you think about that from a resiliency standpoint, vastly more resilient, and you know what? Much more cost effective. This is a Strode. A Strode is a street road hybrid. It's the futon of transportation options. If you think of a futon as an uncomfortable bed that makes into an uncomfortable couch, this is a street that also tries to function as a road. What is a road? A road is a high-speed connection between 2 places. If you think of a modern road as a replacement of the railroad, which was a road on rails, right? In a railroad, you got on one stop, you got off on another. There weren't frontage railroads, drive-through railroads. It was just one stop to another, right? Very high-speed connection. And if you look at this, we've tried to build this with high-speed infrastructure, right? We've got 4 travel lanes, so that way we don't get congestion. We have turn lanes so that we can get the cars out of the way so the cars can go through quickly. These lanes are very wide. They're actually highway scaled lanes. So we put all this investment to get the cars through there quickly. Do the cars get to move through there quickly? No. The speed limits are low. You've got traffic signals that force them to stop. There's nobody driving through here very quickly. So we've invested in a road. We don't get a road. What is a street? A street is and always has been a platform for creating and capturing value. If you look at this, we've put in elements of a street. We put in wide sidewalks, bump outs, decorative lighting. They got banners they put up here during festive seasons. They've tried to do all this to create an environment that would create the most wealth and value that you can. But are we creating wealth and value? No. If you're shopping at this place here and you want to go to this place here, you're not going to walk across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lanes. You're not going to walk down to the light, wait, then walk across and back up. You're just going to get in your car, you're going to whip a U-turn, and you're going to come around and go shopping there, right? And the businesses all know and understand that. So look what they do. They all have parking lots. A lot of them have drive-thrus, and they cater to that customer that's arriving and traveling around by automobile. And your return tends to go more towards that taco restaurant than that old and blighted block. And the value that we get is just not enough. We actually have to start having a conversation about how do we stop building these strode environments, these very expensive, very unsafe, very low productivity environments, and start building either fantastic streets or really good road connections. Our DOTs understand how to build roads. They're brilliant at it. And if we got out of their way and stopped demanding as local officials all these little kind of things that we can get that gin up that quick growth off of, the DOTs would be great. But we have to have a conversation about how do we in our cities start building great streets. If you look, our approach right now today follows the engineer's mantra. An engineer, when they approach any street in our city, is going to say, what is the design speed of this street? What is the volume of traffic that I'm expected to handle? Given those two parameters, how safe can I build, how do I build this road, this street to be safe? And then what is the cost for doing that? Those are the engineer's values that are being applied routinely to every street that we build in this country. If we're going to build truly productive places, we need a different set of values. We actually need to start using your values, right? A different set of values. Tell me, of those 4 values, design speed, design volume, safety, or cost, which one is the most important for you? Okay. Between speed, volume, and cost, which one is the most important to you? Okay? Now, if you could move cars very quickly, or you could move a lot of cars, what would you choose, speed or volume? Okay? We have a universal set of values that we all concur with, that we're not building our places around. If we want truly productive places, places that are going to grow our city's wealth and prosperity, and raise everyone's boats, we have to start talking about applying a different set of values to those places. What your gut is telling you is the right thing, okay? We need to demand something different from our professionals. Here's the last concept, and this one is probably the most important. Yeah. There's an adage out of Silicon Valley that goes like this. Innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb, while innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. This is the old debate between the central server people and the PC people. The debate was, if we just build these huge central servers, everyone can plug into them, and we'll have all this computing power. And then the other group said, no, we need to give everybody a little bit of computing power, and then together they'll create great things, right? And you guys have smartphones, so you know who won that debate, right? Let me show you what this looks like from a city standpoint. This is the city of Memphis. City of Memphis is a fantastic place. I've been fortunate enough to work with their mayor's innovation team, wonderful people. They're doing fantastic things. But Memphis has suffered over the last 60 plus years from doing every single thing that the professionals told them to do that would give them the solution, the wealth, the prosperity. They ran the highways through the middle of the city. They took out buildings to do it. They took out buildings to build parking lots. They ran sewer and water out to the edge of the city. They targeted neighborhoods that they labeled as blight, ripped them down, dislocated the people, put them into high-rise towers in different neighborhoods. They built a beltway. They extended sewer and water out further. They built a second beltway. They paid businesses to move to Memphis. They paid businesses to stay in Memphis. And probably the kind of pinnacle of orderly but dumb is this pyramid. This is their basketball stadium. The city of Memphis, and you can think of a bunch of people in a committee, of the high-powered, highly connected people in the city sitting around going, we've done all these things, and growth is elusive, and the city's really struggling. Do you know what we need? We need a basketball team, If we just had a basketball team, all this stuff would be great. So what we're going to do is we're going to go borrow a couple $100 million, and we're going to build a stadium. And when we build the stadium, we'll get a basketball team, and there'll be all this great stuff that happens, and we'll be a first-class city, and everything will work out wonderfully, right? Memphis get a basketball team. They got the Memphis Grizzlies, right? Here's a problem. When the Grizzlies came to town, they said, we don't like this stadium. So the city actually wound up building them another stadium a few blocks away. This building sits empty. They're now in the process of retrofitting it for a Bass Pro shop. $35 million, $35 million of additional public subsidy in order to get Bass Pro to move in there. Orderly but dumb. Orderly but dumb. Let me show you chaotic but smart. This is also in Memphis, Tennessee. This is a little street called Broad Avenue. Broad Avenue is an old streetcar stop. Some people that were fed up with the decline, fed up with the neglect, fed up with, things just, the city just completely ignoring them, took matters into their own hands. They went and bought buckets of paint. They put in crosswalks. They put in bike lanes. They painted parking lanes. They swept the sidewalks. They swept out the vacant storefronts and got businesses to move in there just for a couple days. They didn't get any permits. They didn't get any health department inspections. They had people selling tacos out of there and ice cream and everything else. They did that all, and they said, you know what, before anybody gets mad at us on Monday morning, we'll be gone, right? We're just going to do this for a weekend. We're going to show that this place has some life, and we're going to take matters into our own hands. And when they got done, it was a pretty nice little deal. I was out there a year after this project. And before the project, most of the storefronts were vacant. When I was out there, every single one was full. All the second and third floors were occupied. I talked to the landlord of one of the buildings. That landlord told me he was able to charge double the rent on the last building to go than he was asking for before the project. Okay? The city has since gone out and documented this. They've shown that there's been over 36 new jobs, over 15 new businesses, $17 million of private sector investment has followed that. Chaotic but smart. Now, I don't know what you guys would do, okay? But I can tell you what my city would do if we went out and did this. Monday morning, the city engineer would be out there saying, that's not our crosswalk standard. The engineer would be out there, the attorney would be out there saying, that's not a straight line. We have potential liability there. Let's get the pressure washers out here and get rid of this, right? We can't have this. Memphis is desperate, and Memphis is smart. They did go out there with pressure washers. They did go out there with pressure washers a few months later to get rid of that so that they could make it permanent. They said, you know what? In our system, our top-down, siloed, hierarchical system, we never, ever would have identified that as a project. But our residents did. And it was successful. And we're not going to let it go backwards. We're going to take the modest little amount of money that it's going to take to put those stripes in there permanently, and we're going to do it. And when we go out there, not only are we going to do the 2 blocks that these residents did, but we're going to go a couple blocks in each direction and say, look, if we expanded this, would some of that good stuff ooze over into other neighborhoods? If it doesn't work, what are they out? A couple $1,000s worth of paint? Not that much. But if it works, you're going to see this continue to incrementally grow and get better. Memphis has gone around and said, are there other neighborhoods in the city that have similar characteristics? We have a lot of old streetcar stops that the streetcar line's been abandoned and now they're just sitting there. Could we go into those neighborhoods and do a similar low-cost intervention and see similar results? And Memphis is in the process right now of going around and doing that. What happens if they don't work? What are you out? A little bit of paint? People had fun on a weekend? A couple ice cream cones? Nothing, right? But what if it does work? Now you've discovered something. Now you've learned something. In government, we're so afraid of failure that we force ourselves to do orderly but dumb things. And what we really need to do is adopt a strategy of fail early and fail small. We need to be open to trying a whole bunch of small little things. How do we identify those? This is George. When I first started writing the blog, and if any of you that ever read a blog, you know that commenters are the greatest thing you have. They're also the worst thing that you have. I would post something at 7 a.m. At 7:10, George would be posting a comment. I don't get it. This doesn't make sense. Explain this differently. 2 weeks ago you said this, and now you said this. Reconcile those. He was just this pain in the neck. And he got my email, and then he started emailing me, and then we became Facebook friends, and I would get these little pop-up messages from him all the time, from George. Explain this, explain that. And he was an annoyance, right? After about a year of this, he sends me this email and says, I'm starting to kind of like you. I'm starting to understand you a little bit. And I would like to host a curbside chat in my community. I would like you to come to my community and talk to them about these things. And so he was about 2 hours from my house. We set that up. We did it. No public officials showed up, but a lot of his neighbors and friends did. And it was a very nice conversation. We went out to eat afterwards, and I remember feeling a little bit depressed. Here's a very nice man doing everything he could. He has no professional background in any of this. He's a trombone player, actually. Not an engineer, not a planner. And I remember sitting at the table going, is this what running a nonprofit is all about? Meeting with well-intentioned people that are never going to be able to do anything with what you're giving them. And I remember leaving there feeling a little bit depressed. Like, is this what my life has become? A couple months later, George sends me an email, and he had asked for a copy of my slides. I'd given them to him. I clicked on the link, and it brought up a video. Here's a video of George at his city council meeting, giving them the curbside chat. He had my presentation, and he had taken out my photos, and he had inserted photos from his community. And so as he went through and he explained it, he gave the presentation that I never could have given. He gave the one from his place. And he gave it from his heart to his people. And as he went through, he explained it all, and he explained it in their local terms. George started a neighborhood group then. They meet at the coffee shop. It started out with just fellow parents that had kids that would walk to school, and the walk to school wasn't safe. So they would get these parents together, and they would walk the kids to school. And then they looked at the route, and they said, what can we do if we plant a shrub here, if we put in a crosswalk there? They started doing little things, right, to make that walk a little bit better. They started going to the city council meetings and planning commission meetings. Walgreens came in with an application to tear down a historic building and build a Walgreens. They got the whole thing changed around. So they got the Walgreens, but the Walgreens kept the historical character of that corner, framed it just beautifully, put the parking in back. All of a sudden, we're looking at George going, George is right? We don't need more Chucks, we need more Georges. So we actually said, how do we create a system where we get more Georges out there? They're the ones that are, identifying these high return investments. Those are the ones, they're the people on the street, on the blocks that know what needs to be done. We started our own group in my hometown called Build a Better Brainerd. We put out a report here a couple months ago detailing 8 neighborhood projects in this one rundown, neglected neighborhood in town that the city could do. Projects that we identified by going out and actually watching how people use the community. We saw the old lady with a walker trying to get over the snowbank. We saw the woman with the stroller trying to get through the ditch. We identified these things by talking to people. What do you need? Why are you out here? Why are you going around this place? I went to the city engineer and I said, you could really use a sidewalk through here. He said, why would you say that, Chuck? We're never going to identify the high return investments from behind a desk. We won't identify the high return investments by doing a survey of the community. We're not going to identify those fine-grained, high-return, low-risk investments by having sticker charts on the wall and having people put, their favorite vote on it. The only way we identify these is by getting out there, looking at our city, watching how our people work, and allowing them to identify them for us. That's our great challenge, because we need to make these investments. These are the ones where we pay $1, we get vastly more than $1 back. And we need to start that fine-grained incremental growth process again. That's what's been lost in our post-World War II development pattern. And your challenge, and it's a challenge we can all meet because it's within all of our budgets and all of our means, is to restart that process. The current path that cities are on is not financially stable. We've literally all done the same thing at the same time. I was in Mississippi last week. I was in British Columbia the week before. We have the same zoning codes, the same road standards, the same building codes, the same financing mechanisms. We have the same big box stores, the same drive-thrus, the same everything. We are the same. We are all fragile to the same thing at the same time. Because of that, the future for most cities is not going to resemble the recent past. We are going through a transition right now, and it is impacting most dramatically local units of government. We have to start thinking dramatically differently about how we build and construct our places. The trajectory we've been on for the last 60 years is just not viable for the next 60. We have to rethink what we're doing. And because of that, the main determinant of future prosperity for cities will be the ability of local leaders to transform their communities. How do we create those platforms where George will step up in all of our places? Step up, and how do we support that? How do we allow those fine-grained investments to be identified? How do we allocate the resources to make those come to fruition? And how do we restart that incremental growth pattern that is essential to building wealth and prosperity? Our website is at strongtowns.org. We do a blog every day of the week. We do a podcast once a week, a TV video once a week. You're welcome to use all of that, copy it, share it, rewrite it, and put your name on it. I don't really care. Just share it with people and use it in your communities. We started a social network earlier this year at strongtowns.net. That is for people who are interested in working on this in the local communities. George is actually on that site. We are all trying to figure things out. And so if you're interested in working with other people to see what works, what doesn't work, here's what I'm trying. There's a bunch of kindred spirits there at strongtowns.net. About a year ago, we put out a book. It's kind of a 101 on Strong Towns thinking. These are the only I had left in the office, like 10 of them. So I brought them here tonight. They're $10 each if you're interested in one. They're also online on Amazon. And they're half that on Kindle if you have a Kindle. Thank you so much for being here, for inviting me. And I would love to answer any questions or talk about anything you guys want to chat about. Thank you. Go ahead.
What did you use when you calculated the value of
Yeah, I have to repeat the question because they're recording this. What did we use to calculate the value of the land? We use publicly available data. So essentially we use assessor's data. And we're looking at this from the city standpoint. So it's less about like what the market value would be than what the assessed value is, because that relates directly to the city's cash flow. So we use assessor's data primarily because we can get it. Does that make sense? No? Well, okay, the assessor will go out and say, this property has this value, the land has this value, the improvements have this value, and then essentially this is the value that we assign to the land, and the taxes that you pay are a function of that. Yeah. You guys have an auditor that do that? Okay. The auditor. We call it assessor, yeah. Actually, I went to the International Conference of Property Assessors. So I think it's more than just us, but please.
In your calculations, are you variable beside property tax?
The question was, in our calculations, are there any variables besides property tax? In the ones that we have done that I showed you tonight, the examples before the graphs, those were all property taxes because in those communities that was the only source of revenue that was tied to the property. In Joe Minicozzi's work, he has included sales tax in that, because the one like I showed you in North Carolina, they can get real fine-grained sales tax data, and the sales tax is a significant portion. In Minnesota, the sales tax isn't a significant portion. In fact, we don't have a local sales tax unless it's approved and dedicated to a specific project.
Any of your studies include earned income tax?
No, I have not seen a study that includes an earned income tax. That would be very interesting. And really, at the end of the day, as an organization, if you look today, we have an immensely complex tax code at the top that gets simpler as you go down. And I realize it's not simple at the local level, but it's vastly simpler than that. We've done that because we're trying to streamline things. We really need to invert that and have the simplest tax code possible here, and then give cities an enormous amount of flexibility, because some cities need an income tax, because that's where it's going to make sense for them. Cities need to be able to have sales taxes. They need to be able to have property taxes, land taxes. They need to be able to customize at the local level the tax structure that reflects the makeup and composition of their communities. And we simply have blunt instruments today at the local level when it comes to taxation. Please.
We're from a village of under 4,000 and
Okay.
have a vibrant downtown, but not much area for business growth. And our village government is now being asked to fund the road and infrastructure into about 30-some acres of a commerce park that's been being worked on by volunteers for over 10 years. Do you have any advice?
The question was, there's a proposal to build a commerce park on the edge of the city. Would I have any advice? I think, obviously I don't know your community. A couple things that you said, though, raised some red flags to me. You said, we don't have any room for growth. I have never met a community in this country that did not have.
Well, we have a green belt around the village, and there are some parcels around the belt that they're but
Sure.
aren't interested in selling.
But that the traditional development pattern, understand, is not, oftentimes today we look at growth as being something that is done and then kind of put under glass. And our cities really function best as almost as living organisms, where the growth continues to happen in small increments and maturing. So there is if your city has no room for growth, your city will die, because cities need to continually renew themselves and have that incremental growth pattern. So to me, I question the base assumption. We don't have room for growth. Even if you put in a green belt, your city has you're 4,000 people. You have a long ways to mature before you become Manhattan. So you have a lot of growth potential. If you're asking me, should we make this investment on the edge? The thing about that freaks me out is that it sounds very speculative. In other words, we're going to make this huge investment, hoping that all this growth happens. And that is a large build it and they will come style of gamble. I'm not sure what your objective is. If your objective is to increase your tax base or grow jobs, I think there's much higher returning, lower risk investments that you could make than something that is that risky. Please. How did we calculate our second cycle, the cost of the second cycle? Well, largely, in like the 3 examples that we used and the other ones that are on our website, I am an engineer, so we sat down and said, okay, of this portion of the project, what portion of that is going to need to be redone when we get to the end of this? So there's a little bit of assumptions and math in there. We also did it, and one of the kind of underlying assumptions is that the increase in cost will be the same as the increase in property value. In other words, the inflation rate of property and the inflation rate of the costs will be the same. That is a very conservative assumption, because generally the costs rise faster than the underlying tax base. But we, broke down the project in a sense. Here's what it costs today. Here's the portion of that is going to be spent the next time around, and use that number. Your engineer can do that. That's not a hard one. Please.
We're a region that is not really growing in population, and a decision that one community makes has an effect on there's a cause and effect relationship.
Right, right.
One community chooses to build an interchange, could have a negative effect on a nearby community that is really people around.
Right.
What have you seen that has worked in other communities that mitigate those negative effects of growth in one area, one definite effect on another community?
Right. So the question is, for the most part, we're not adding a lot of people. We're just moving people around. And I'll put some words in your mouth. When the Walmart opens up here, it sucks the life out of other places. So everybody fights for the Walmart, right? I get that. I understand that. I see that. The question was, what have you seen successfully to mitigate that? I've never seen anything successfully mitigate that. Because to me, and I get called in all the time, will you come in and help us with the Walmart? We're trying to kill this Walmart project. It's really important to understand that Walmart, McDonald's, strip malls, the whole cacophony of that kind of commercial development is a byproduct of the choices that we have made on how to build our places. People are upset with Walmart. They shouldn't be upset with Walmart. They should be upset with the way we have chosen to invest in our transportation system. If you as a local community are going to widen out all your streets, force everybody into their cars, you're making the next community to get that Walmart the most competitive community in the world. If you're going to instead focus on incrementally building your neighborhoods, making them more prosperous, making them places that people want to invest in and be in, if you're going to start embracing congestion in your cities as actually a sign of success and not a sign of failure, you can start to incrementally change that model. It's not an easy solution. It's not a silver bullet. But if we as a local community say, you know what, we can compete for that Walmart. We know it is a 15-year investment that then will go bad, and we're going to have these, it will give us an illusion of wealth, but long-term we're not going to be better off. We're going to make our investments differently. I think those communities can be very successful. Conversely now, let's look at the Walmart model. And I'll focus on Walmart. I'm not trying to pick on them, but they're kind of synonymous with the whole thing. If you look at Walmart, there's two aspects of the Walmart development model that are incredibly fragile. Walmart depends on being able to go to one company. You're going to go to you. I picked on you already once today. And say, okay, you produce toilet paper. We're going to buy 20 billion rolls of toilet paper from you. What's your price? And then we'll go to you and say, we're going to buy 20 billion toilet paper roll from you. What's your price? And you say, well, I could produce 1 billion, but not 20 billion. It's 20 billion or nothing. I want the lowest price possible. So I pit you two off against each other, and you're like 0.01 cents cheaper, so I buy 20 billion from you. And so it's this ability to essentially, outsource everything. That is a byproduct of the second issue, which is very low transportation costs. Because what happens when you're Walmart, the genius of Walmart is that they've been able to say, okay, now you got the contract for toilet paper. You bought a roll of toilet paper off the shelf, so now I'll buy one from you at this very low price. And then I'm going to get it to the store in less than 30 days. Okay? Before, you used to have like 90 days, 120 days worth of inventory. Well, if you think about how you walk into Walmart, look at how much stuff is on the shelves. There's like millions and millions of dollars worth of stuff. Okay? If you have 120 days worth of stuff, think of Walmart, everything turns over in 3 or 4 days. If you have 120 days worth of stuff in your supply chain, that is a ton of money you have just tied up in stuff, right? But if you can get that supply chain down, and I can put the burden on you, and I can lower that supply chain to 30 days, well, all of a sudden now, I can not only drive down the price, but I make a ton of money doing it. Okay? Here's why that's fragile. What happens when the cost of gas goes from $3 a gallon to $4 to $5 to $6? You already see with gas, in the $3 to $4 range for the last couple of years, you see Walmart's, same store sales start to dip. And that really, they said that shouldn't happen because in a recession, more people should shop at Walmart. But it's not happening. It's going the other way. And Walmart is being squeezed out at the margins. Why? Because their cost of doing business is solely tied to this transportation model. As our DOTs struggle just to maintain what they have, as the price of gas continues to creep up with the dollar devaluation and with the price of energy going up just naturally, there's a squeezing of that model. So to me, you have a short-term and a long-term decision. We can embrace that growth model and really create a short-term illusion of wealth with a long-term hangover for ourselves, or we can redirect those resources to building incrementally and be more resilient when that Walmart model goes away. Because literally, they're being replaced by Amazon, and their business model is very, very, very fragile. Please.
Have you ever looked at the policies that reward what we're doing because we're doing versus those policies that inhibit what we should be doing?
Yeah. Have we ever looked at the policies that reward what we're doing as opposed to inhibit? It's interesting because, from a financing standpoint, if you go look at the fantastic Main Street down here, the nice things that are going on, if you want to finance that stuff, it's incredibly difficult. If you went and said to the finance people, I want a loan to build a traditional downtown building with commercial on the bottom and residential on the top, it may be rental, I may live there, they would say to you, we have no such funding product. We have really no way to finance that. You might get a bank to fund it locally, but there's no secondary market for it. And because there's no secondary market, and that's a product of FHA rules, it's a product of Securities Exchange Commission regulations, there's a certain percentage of commercial and residential that they will fund. They're just numbers on a sheet, but they've had dramatic impact because they basically have made it illegal to fund downtowns. Our zoning codes largely don't allow downtowns. They don't allow traditional neighborhoods. In my hometown, the front yard setback's 20 feet. Well, you can go through all the neighborhoods. 20 feet is a suburban code. You can go through all the neighborhoods and see the houses are set back 5 feet from the edge of the property line. Why would we make every single house in our community non-conforming? We do that because we've just adopted these codes. So I do think the iteration that cities should do first is to go through and ask themselves, what are all those things that keeps our best neighborhoods, the places that we like the most, from being built today? What would stop that from happening? And you'd be amazed because there's a ton of it. Our street standards, our building codes, our zoning codes, largely set up to prohibit all of that stuff. You can get around all of it. You can change it all. There's great models out there. But the default post-World War II would make most of it illegal. It's a huge problem. Please.
What are some examples of regions within the country that have acted in ways to support the type of incremental growth and support for strong towns?
Very early on, as I started to go around have this conversation in Minnesota near my hometown, I had a local, I'm not suggesting this is you, but I had a local critic that would follow me around. And when we get to the Q&A, she'd always, tell me where the strong towns are, Chuck. What makes you so smart? Where are they? Are you the only person who's figured this out? I don't see, I see pockets of stuff working. I don't see any region that is doing this. I don't see any, city that systematically has embraced a different approach. There's pockets of it. And let me give you the two extremes. Martin County, Florida, kind of a regional, it's a county, it's working on a county-wide basis. They started this group. If you go in Martin County, Florida to get a permit, you're talking 3.5 years to get a permit. I don't know what it takes here. In Minnesota, we have a 60-day rule. So, if you submit an application, you got to have a response within 60 days. I'm not joking to you, 3.5 years. And that's completely acceptable. That's that's the way we do things here. It's insane. They started this group because they were getting such poor results. They started this group, and when you go into the city, you can either go through the traditional 3.5-year process and get your traditional zoning permit and all that. There's 23 different departments you go to get approvals. Or you can go to this group. And what this group does is they start out by redesigning your thing and helping you, basically build it in a traditional style, and then they will take it to all the departments and get your approval. And they're averaging 6 months. So it's a way to say, we've got a group, and it's a cross-disciplinary team. They've got engineer, architect, urban designer, planner, they've got this whole team of people that sit down and kind of take a systems approach to that development and walk it through the system. I see that as a successful model, as like a pilot. And the idea is if it works there, we're going to export it to other parts of the city or other parts of the county. Here's the other extreme. What is the most innovative city in the country today? Detroit, right? And why are we seeing so much innovation, particularly in the private sector, almost exclusively in the private sector in Detroit? Because there's an absence of rules, right? The rules are all there, but there's nobody there to enforce them. If you want to see an interesting place, go to downtown Detroit today. There is this like gravity that is pulling all of these young people there. And it's pulling them there because they can live there cheaply, they can do whatever they want, they can be creative, they don't have to get permits, they don't have to get licenses, they're not bogged down by the system we have today. And they are creating amazing things. And it's really spectacular. Now, it's chaotic, right? It's chaotic, and if we said to our residents, we're going to create a Detroit-like zone here in our downtown to allow, that's how that would go over, right? And I'm not saying the answer here is anarchy and no government, but to me, those two very different ends of the spectrum are interesting case studies in how things are starting to change. We do, if you guys have a business card and you would like to we do have a follow-up kind of emails for people that will kind of give you this in like little segments. If you're interested in that, just leave a business card up here and I'll get you on our list. Otherwise, I'll stand up here, and anybody that wants to chat one-on-one, I'll shut off the mic and we can do that. Thank you so much, you guys.